Good morning, everybody. I'm Ron Brownstein, a senior editor here at The Atlantic. Thank you for joining us for our big story event today that we're calling America After Trump. Since The Atlantic's founding in 1857, our writers have examined our fragile democracy and the potential threats it faces. Those contemporary threats came to a head last week when Trump-supporting rioters stormed and forcefully entered the Capitol while the House and Senate were fulfilling their constitutional duties of certifying the Electoral College results of the election. Those results, of course, show that Joe Biden was the winner. It was the biggest challenge to our system of government, maybe in our lifetimes. And the scenes were shocking, to say the least, but to many observers, they weren't surprising. Over the next 45 minutes or so, we will discuss the factors that led to last week's attack, what the future holds for the outgoing president and his Republican Party, the challenges facing the incoming president, Joe Biden, where American democracy goes from here, and more. We have a great group watching us today from across the country. Welcome to you all. We'll integrate a few of your questions throughout the event. You can submit them through the chat feature below. Please let us know if you submit a question where you are watching from. And now let's introduce our panel. Clint Smith is a staff writer for The Atlantic who has been covering the racist underpinnings of last week's insurrection. Anne Applebaum, also a staff writer at The Atlantic. She covers the future of the Republican Party and political extremism. She is also the author of the book, Twilight of Democracy, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism. Could not be more timely. And Adrienne LaFrance is the executive editor of The Atlantic. She is one of the foremost experts on conspiracy theories like QAnon, how they spread like wildfire on social media. Welcome to all of you. I think we have an episode of competitive bookcases on Room Raider going here, in addition to our political conversation. But let me start with you, Adrienne. You wrote the cover story a year ago on the QAnon phenomenon. And obviously, it is one of the most elaborate and improbable conspiracy theories we have seen in modern times. Were you surprised that it appeared to play such a central role in the violence?
First of all, thanks for having me. And I am very jealous of all of your bookcases, so I need to up my game. But for QAnon, no, I mean, I wasn't surprised at all. And I think it's primarily, I mean, if you look at the folks who participated in this insurrection, it wasn't uniformly Q people, but they were certainly peppered throughout the crowd. And I think the upshot there is really about the nature of this conspiracy theory and the extent to which, like, at its very core, it's a pro-Trump conspiracy theory, and that the people who've adopted it, by and large, have adopted it because it plugs into this existing worldview. So then if you look across the larger crowd, I mean, and I'm, basing this on the forums where you saw people organizing for this violence, it is the same worldview. So even if it's not the most enthusiastic pro-Q people, you see this overlap in worldview that has Trump at its center, but it's much larger than Q too.
Define the worldview a little bit. Give people a sense of kind of what are the components of it.
Sure. So, I mean, like many conspiracy theories, it's very anti-establishment and distrustful of expertise, institutions that uphold democracy, that kind of thing. But again, this goes back to Trump being at the center of it. It's really this idea that something about the way America used to be, and it's sort of deliberately vague in how people talk about this, has been lost and needs to be reclaimed. And so obviously there are elements of racism, there are elements of anti-Semitism that are highly visible in this. But it's really, if you sort of like comb through the Q literature, as it were, which I wouldn't necessarily recommend to anyone, I've done it, you'll just find it's echoing the Trump rhetoric to a T. I mean, everything from fake news to enemy of the people, to just all of the sort of most abhorrent and sort of escalating violent rhetoric that you find in the Trump presidency is right there in Q too.
One of the places where you find this rhetoric, obviously, in most concentrated form, is in all sorts of social media. And you wrote another cover story that described Facebook as a doomsday machine, rather memorably. Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, others, they have finally banned Trump from their platforms. We'll see how long that lasts. And they have removed many other accounts. Is it too little, too late? I mean, what do you make of the role social media played in the expansion of this extremism over the last few years? And are they doing enough, or are they even on track to do enough to combat it?
Well, I'm dying to talk to Anne about this too, because I know she's thought deeply about this. I mean, for me, I see this as on one hand, yes, too little, too late. These networks that have spread disinformation, misinformation, propaganda that are encouraging violence are these very well-worn sort of networks that have just been established over many years, and this social media has turned a blind eye to them. And so, the most cynical part of me is like, oh, how convenient. 8 days before the end of the presidency, you're suddenly like, oh, we should maybe do something about this. And the line—
someone new with regulatory power happens to be coming in. Strange.
Sure.
The light bulb goes off.
Totally. And not only that, but also like, okay, so your line is that the US Capitol is attacked. Like that's the thing that spurs action. Like that's disheartening. And so I think it is too little, too late, but not just because of the sort of like why the timing, why did it take so long, but also just, the scale of these platforms. And this is what I wrote about in the Doomsday article that you referenced. Just, I have been thinking for a long time about the extent to which Facebook, for example, has not really acknowledged the extent to which or taken responsibility for the fact that it's a media company of sorts. And what I've come to realize actually is that it's not just a media company, it's the scale of this thing, 2 billion users, is unlike anything we've ever seen in history. And we haven't even begun to figure out how to deal with that as a society. And so to me, I've reached a point where I sort of don't understand how Facebook, for example, but YouTube is a really important example as well, how they continue to exist as is, even with more aggressive banning, and expect anything more than further violence. So I'm sort of pessimistic on the social media.
And I have something else I want to ask you, but do you want to weigh in on kind of the role of social media in the evolution of the extremism that we've seen?
Sure. I mean, I agree and read avidly everything that Adrienne writes about this. I still think most Americans don't understand how exactly social media works and how radicalizing it is. I think most people still don't know that the Google search results they see are catered to them, that they see a set of results that would be different if they were using their friend's computer or a computer in the next state. And the degree to which we all live in separate world, each of us has our own internet world. I think that's not understood, but also the degree to which people are radicalized online. The New York Times actually had a great piece today where it went back through some of the Facebook accounts of some of the people who were at the Capitol last week. And they start out very normal, they're exchanging, recipes with their cousins. And then they become radicalized as they realize that joining the Stop the Steal campaign or the Trump group gives them more followers and more energy, and they are brought into something online by things that they've seen on Facebook. So it's not a passive thing. I mean, it actively entices people and encourages extremism. And what Adrienne alluded to, I'm writing something now, and I won't give it all away, partly because I'm arguing with my co-author about exactly how it's going to be framed. But I'm writing something now about how we might think about regulation. And by regulation, I do not mean, taking down President Trump's Twitter account or taking down this piece of content or that piece of content. I'm talking about the much deeper structure of the platforms and their deeper relationship to the rest of us. So, for example, should we have some kind of access into the black box of algorithms? Should there be people working alongside those who work on the algorithms to make sure that we understand what they're doing and how they work? How can we build more transparency in the system so that people know what they're seeing and why they're seeing it when they get a political ad, why they've been targeted with that ad? What are the elements? How can we build the values of democracy? Transparency, openness, and an encouragement of civic debate and better discourse. How can we build algorithms that promote that into our internet to replace what we have? I mean, the strange thing right now is that on the one hand, there is such a thing as an autocratic internet, and it's called the Chinese internet. Mm-hmm. And we know what it looks like, and it has the values of, surveillance and control built into it. And then there's our internet, which is not democratic at all. It's run by 5 or 6 companies who are secretive, who don't tell us how their system works, who make arbitrary decisions that we have no control over. That has to change, and I hope that this election will have inspired a much deeper conversation. I mean, actually, the United States is well behind other countries in having this conversation. The EU, for example, is some steps ahead and is already beginning to propose and discuss legislation.
So thank you. So Clint, when we talk about, as Anne did and Adrienne did, radicalization, extremism, in many ways, the searing defining image of that during the attack was something that we did not see throughout the Civil War, which was someone carrying the Confederate flag through the Capitol. You've written about the power of that image and its symbolism. What was your takeaway from seeing the Confederate flag kind of parading through the Capitol as part of this mob?
Yeah, I mean, it was striking. It was a striking image, and as soon as I saw it, I thought to your point about how even throughout the entirety of the Civil War, not at one point did the Confederate flag reach the U.S. Capitol, and I'm thinking a lot about, just to provide some context, we still collectively as a country don't fully understand the extent to which the Confederacy was a treasonous army that was fighting a war predicated on maintaining and expanding the institution of slavery. And so we've had these conversations over the course of the last several months and really the last several years about whether Confederate statues should come down, whether they should be contextualized. But I think it's important to remember what the Confederacy fought for and what they stood for, and they name it explicitly, right? If you go back to the Declarations of Confederate Secession in 1861, all of these states, as they're seceding from the Union, are naming quite explicitly why they are leaving it. Mississippi, for example, says that, quote, our interests are thoroughly aligned with the institution of slavery, the greatest material good in the world, right? So they are not opaque about why they want to leave and ultimately why the Civil War will be fought. And so when I'm seeing that battle flag move through the Capitol, and I see it beneath a photo of Charles Sumner, who was a senator from South Carolina, or a senator from Massachusetts, who was an ardent abolitionist and who was beaten on the Senate floor by a member of the House of Representatives, Preston Brooks, from South Carolina, for a speech that he gave arguing against slavery. When I see that flag surrounded by a portrait of John Calhoun, who was an enslaver, who was the former vice president of the United States to both John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson, and who was a senator from South Carolina, who wrote a speech and advocated for policies in which he said that slavery was, quote, a positive good. This was the best thing that could have happened to Black people. And so there are questions about why John Calhoun's portrait is hanging in the halls of Congress in the first place, and why so many people who shared similar views are hanging there. But I thought that flag sort of bookended in some ways and surrounded by those images reflected the dissonance and the disconnect and the tension in many ways between who our country has purported to be and who we have actually been historically. And that this flag that was flown over the bodies of dead Union soldiers who were fighting to, or dead Union soldiers and dead Confederate soldiers who again were fighting a war to expand the institution of slavery, that this flag was flown by people at Ku Klux Klan rallies in the 20s and the 50s when they were attempting to intimidate civil rights activists, when they were attempting to intimidate and prevent young Black children from integrating these schools. And now it is flown and will forever be remembered and associated with this violent, largely white insurrection that is unprecedented, not in the sense that there have not been violent white mob insurrections before, but in the sense that it has happened in this context at the U.S. Capitol on the day when senators and Congress members were voting to formalize the election.
Calhoun relevant not only because of his views on slavery, but also very much relevant because of his views on minority rule and how the South could try to maintain control of national policy even while representing only a clear minority of the country, and something that we're kind of experiencing again in many ways in an anti-majoritarian Republican Party. But Clint, let me ask you one follow-up, and then I'll kind of bring in some of the audience questions. Not only in this crowd but more broadly in Trump's messaging to his audience, central has always been this sense of racial and cultural dispossession, of something being lost, make America great again. When he went down to Georgia for the first rally that he did for the Republican Senate candidates in Valdosta, he said, "This is our country," to a virtually all white rural audience. "This is our country, and they are trying to take it away from us through stealing and rigging the election." His attacks on fraud centered on cities with large African-American population, his claims of fraud in Detroit and Philadelphia and Atlanta, even though if you look from 16 to 20, his share of the vote declined much more in largely white inner suburbs, or at least racially diverse inner suburbs of those cities, not in the cities themselves. So if you kind of look at all of this, and particularly after an event like this, where the racial component, as you point out in the presence of the flag, was so vivid, do you see appeals to kind of racial resentment receding when Trump does, or is the GOP now too dependent on a base that responds to those messages to move away from them?
I'm not in the business of prediction, so it's difficult to say. But I think what's important to remember is that this did not begin with Trump, right? You can go back to 1865, and Andrew Johnson is saying many of the same things that Trump is. He was saying that this is a country founded by white people for white people, and that when we imagine what Reconstruction should look like, this is why he diverged from Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction so vehemently, in part because they shared fundamentally different ideologies, and that he fundamentally believed that Black people should not have access to the political power of enfranchisement, because that would create a fundamentally different South at that time, which would create a sort of sharing of power that was not how he imagined the founders to have imagined the sort of larger American project. And then you can also just go look at the Tea Party before Trump, right, in which we see the sort of seeds of the modern iteration of the seeds that would become, in many ways, Trumpism. And we see that racial resentment was deeply embedded into the sort of early stages of that movement. And so I'm not sure that we will, I feel pretty confident that we will not see the end of racial resentment being deeply entangled in conservative and Republican politics. If anything, I think as the country continues to, not that demographics is destiny, as has been said before, but as the demographics of this country continue to shift, and as young people and the sort of ideological makeup of young people continues to move further to the left, I think that we will continue to see Republicans create electoral and political infrastructures that allow them to maintain as much power as possible, even when the population and the sort of ideological and political dispositions of those around them continue to move away from their policies.
Yeah, I will certainly agree with that. And actually my last piece right before the election was why the 2020s could be the most dangerous decade since the 1850s, precisely for that reason, I think, because of the action-reaction cycle of, as the country becomes more diverse in every way, demographically, culturally, religiously, the efforts by the Republican Party to find ways to maintain power, even as a minority, are likely to grow more intense. Let me bring in a few of the audience questions, because we certainly have a lot of them. And maybe Anne, with your kind of international perspective on having watched this in other places as well as the US, might be a good place for Greg from California. Wants to know, how does our political discourse recover from the delusions of alternative facts and fake news, so debate can start from a shared understanding of reality? Can you put that genie back in the bottle?
That is really the million-dollar question, and there isn't an easy answer. And I think in an article that I wrote before the election, I said that usually there are two ways in which these kinds of problems of deep polarization end. One of them is a civil war, in which one side wins and the other loses. And the other is some kind of outside intervention, like you had in Northern Ireland. Someone comes in and, creates some kind of space where people can debate and so on. And I don't think have that in the United States. Unfortunately, I don't think we have I don't really see the Canadians coming in to negotiate, or the Mexicans coming in to, to create some kind of, public debating system. So I don't think it's going to happen. I mean, having said that, it's not to say that it's not that it can't ever happen. Someone pointed out to me recently an example that I hadn't thought of, which is that of Quebec, which was a violently and angrily polarized society between French speakers and English speakers, French speakers who wanted to secede from Canada and English speakers who wanted to stay. And there was a political process over many years that mostly involved making the conversation more boring, that got people to calm down and focus on reality. I mean, generally the lesson from these kinds of, from whether it's post-conflict situations or post-Civil War or difficult, post-authoritarian situations, is that the faster you can get people talking about something real, and the faster you can get them not, the more you can get them not talking about the culture war or the ideological division or whatever are these mega identity issues that bother people, and the more we can talk about fixing the roads, fixing the healthcare systems, getting people back to work, the faster the problem will be solved. I have a hunch that the Biden administration understands this. I mean, that was a little bit how Biden ran his campaign. His campaign ads were focused very much on, here are real Americans, real families, they have real problems, let's solve them. And he kind of didn't do the culture war. He didn't go there. He just didn't talk about it. And that will be a frustrating solution for a lot of people. But in terms of pulling in at least those members of the Republican, pro-Republican or pro-Trump, the part of that coalition that is amenable to being brought back into political discourse, this may be the way to do it. So if we're all talking about how to build a bridge over the river, then we're not talking about, Christians versus Muslims versus whatever. I mean, then we're not having an existential or a theological discussion about things that can't be resolved.
And that is, this will be an interesting test of that, because I think you're exactly right. He wants to avoid culture and identity politics and kind of, be a bread and butter lunch bucket, a Democrat, and it will be telling to see whether those kind of tangible goods can overcome the power of identity, kind of the drug of shared identity that Trump offers.
I mean, there are also some things that can be done directly to do with fixing democracy, and some of them are very technical, and we don't have to go into them. But I mean, I do expect there to be a new Voting Rights Act. I do expect more conversation about ranked choice voting and other ways of, and ending gerrymandering and other ways of, there are some elements of our democracy that don't have to be as bad as they are, and that are bad because our institutions need, very badly need updating. I also wouldn't be surprised if we got to the question of statehood for DC and Puerto Rico, for example. But, I don't think that's going to be the next 6 months.
Yeah, on those fronts, I mean, HR 1, which they passed last year, would deal with gerrymandering, would deal with tremendously expanding access to voting across the country. Obviously, the House passed a new Voting Rights Amendment. All of that, Clint, will depend on whether they are willing to end the filibuster, however, in the Senate, because even the Voting Rights Act conceivably might get 10 Republican votes. Difficult. Other democracy expansion, very unlikely. Let's file that and come back, because Tina has a question that kind of plays off what we were just talking about. Adrienne, can I ask you, do you think there's any getting through to Trump supporters in terms of truth, or is it too late, as in post-truth, and also whether you can reach many of those voters? Is there any way? Obama, I remember at the end of his presidency, kind of lamented there was no way to talk to voters in kind of red America except through the filters of overtly conservative media that kind of obviously channeled and limited his message. Is there a way of reaching perhaps those, certainly in the conspiracy world, but even those maybe several circles outside of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think about this along two tracks. One is on the individual level, because this comes up a lot because of how widespread conspiracy theorizing is lately, or seems to be, how visible it is in any case. Just people who are like, how do I reach my sister or my aunt or this person who has fallen down a QAnon hole and like bring them back to reality? And I think the individual relationships and even like actual brick and mortar communities like the church you go to or would if it weren't coronavirus. These are the relationships where I think people can get through to one another, you know, with respect, with love, saying like, how many people would have to be in on this for it to be true? Like, what is it that, you know, just earnestly asking people why they believe in these things. I think on the broader level, I mean, this to me, the way I've been thinking about it in the past week in any case, is a question of accountability. And this goes a little bit to the question that you asked Clint about the future of Republican politics. I'm sort of wondering, you know, what does accountability for this insurrection look like? And this is really, I mean, Anne is the expert in complicity. Her cover story was on this topic was amazing. And I'm wondering if there isn't robust complicity, what does that enable? And especially in terms of conspiracy theorizing, but even just sort of the continued lies and those who have been lying to the American people feeling sort of very comfortable continuing to do so. So I sort of throw part of that question over to Anne, because I've been really wondering what accountability.
Let me ask Clint one question from the audience, and then Anne will ask you, because certainly we heard over and over again yesterday from Republicans in the House that accountability would mean more division. And I would be interested in your take on whether accountability is a necessary stepping stone toward some version of reunification. But Clint, can I ask you first? Sarah from Ridgecrest, California, asks, would someone please speak to the issue of law enforcement personnel often sympathizing with extremist and racist views and often posting their views on social media? To what extent does law enforcement reinforce the insurrectionist movement?
Yeah, so what's becoming increasingly clear is that there were people within the Capitol Police force who were varying degrees of sympathetic to what was happening that day. And obviously what is true is that it is a heterogeneous group of people who don't all share the same politics, who don't all share the same ideologies. Somebody recently wrote a piece about how many of the Black police officers in the Capitol Police Force were telling their the folks in the higher ups in the force for not just days before or weeks before, but for months and for years, that there were conspiracy theorists among them, that there were people who were sympathetic to Trump, to people who they worried might put some other Congress members and people within the Capitol in danger, and they felt as if they weren't being listened to. So, you know, we are seeing this, and we have seen different iterations of this over the last several years as the Black Lives Matter movement has helped us more forcefully interrogate the role of policing in this country, what it should look like and what it does look like. And I think it's something to be taken seriously. And it's something that I think we're still attempting to uncover and get a better sense of what the sort of relationship or the Venn diagram of that looks like. But there certainly is a relationship and one that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, thanks. And so can you address kind of the argument yesterday over and over again, Republicans saying that if there's accountability, if you hold Trump accountable, you will further divide the country, and not incidentally kind of threatening, as Lindsey Graham did perhaps most explicitly, that there's going to be more violence if there's accountability. What do you make of that? What's the lessons from other countries that have tried to deal with the aftermath of these kinds of events, or even more shattering ones?
So it had a terrible echo for me, that argument yesterday, and I apologize for it because it's not really an appropriate comparison. But this is how Stalin used to talk to the Ukrainian peasants. You know, if you complain about the fact that I've starved you and mistreated you, you know, then things will get really bad. And if you've been starved and mistreated, you know, you have only yourselves to blame. And this is kind of classic dictator's way of threatening opponents. I mean, I have to say, I listened to a lot of the impeachment debate yesterday. It wasn't really a debate, actually. It was a terrible sort of this side, that side, awful echo chamber. And what was really interesting to me was that, number one, the Democrats talked about the insurrection, you know, whether it was how afraid they were or how terrible it was, or the Republicans talked about the Democrats. The Democrats are socialists, they're Marxists, they want gun control, they're going to take your guns away. They've exaggerated, or they're divisive, they're cutting corners, they're doing this impeachment too fast. It was a completely uneven conversation. And my impression from that, I mean, first of all, this is a kind of Vichy logic that, our leader, that nothing that Trump can do is ever as bad as the terrible threat posed by the Democratic Party. And this kind of the logic of people living in an occupied country, how they justify their loyalty to somebody who's bad. This is exactly how you do that. You don't talk about the problem. You don't talk about what Trump has done that's bad. You talk about the other side and why what they're doing is terrible. It's sort of classic way of avoiding accountability and avoiding responsibility. And it was really very striking how the 9 or 10 Republicans who objected sounded so completely different, because what they were, what made them similar to the Democrats was the fact that they talked about the insurrection and why it was bad. And so the division inside the House was people yesterday who were speaking about the insurrection and thinking about it and how to cope with it and how to move forward, and people who were still engaged in a culture war. And it's a terrible sign for moving forward.
And that was about 18-1 in the division in the Republican,
unfortunately, yes,
in the Republican Party. Clint, let me ask you a very almost philosophical question from Megan from Brussels. One of the principles of politicians were expected to apply was to lead rather than follow, whereas there seems to be a growing tendency to follow the perceived preferences of voters to keep power. How can the leadership principles be reinstated in those who hold elected office? Obviously, this is not limited to the USA. In other words, Republicans will often tell us, as well, I'm imprisoned by the base. I can't. This is the way I have to go. Is that the only choice you have when you're in elected office?
It's certainly not, and something that I think about all the time, just on a sort of fundamental level, is like, what are you there to do? Like, if the only goal is to be reelected over and over again, and to, as soon as you are elected, try to move toward and imagine what is necessary in order for you to be reelected, rather than making a set of moral, ethical, and choices that are based in your conscience. And I think that that's what we saw in the Republican Party yesterday, is some of that division and some of that early fissure, where you have someone like Liz Cheney, who says that I'm not making this vote based on pressure from the base, pressure from within her own party, and now the Freedom Caucus is trying to remove her from leadership, right? But I think she is, even though ideologically I believe probably very little of what Liz Cheney believes, I think there is something to be said for what it means to recognize that this is a moment that demands a vote of conscience, and that demands a recognition that this is bigger than what is going to take for you to get reelected, that this is bigger and more monumental and more central to the continuation of this republic than the impact that it might have on your electoral prospects. It's a choice that everyone can make, and unfortunately, we saw hundreds of Republicans for a variety of reasons, some because of fear, some because of the sort of confluence of fear and electoral in the base, and make a different set of choices.
And in fact, go out of their way to kind of minimize the gravity of what happened, to really take the opposite of your point of view of this being a signal event that may foreshadow much deeper problems ahead, as just something, it kind of got out of hand. I mean, almost unruly, a word like that. Adrienne, lots of questions coming back to the question of how we deal with social media companies, and several people have asked versions. Carl from DC and others. Section 230, a phrase that most people had never heard 4 months ago, now being raised by various points on the spectrum. Can you explain what the debate is and how big an impact it might have to revoke or revise Section 230?
I can, without getting too technical. I mean, I think it goes to this question of what kind of internet we have and should have and want. And so if you go back to the very earliest days of the web, there weren't these giant tech companies that sort of controlled basically everything, these walled gardens and we've seen, of course, this week, the tremendous power that their executives wield over who gets to participate in these platforms that are operating at scale and so therefore very influential. And so the question becomes, do we want to go back to an internet where it's, more of an open, I don't want to say equal playing field, but that, there isn't necessarily the massive scale. And, you think about Facebook owning Instagram and the Google and YouTube having a shared parent company. And so it gets to this question of when, and I won't get too deep into the details of 230 because I don't want to get things wrong. But it goes to this question of this, legislation that was created at a time when we didn't have the social web as it was today, and rethinking whether it still applies or whether it excuses, for instance, all culpability for a platform like Facebook to say, we're just a neutral vessel for whatever appears on our platform. And so these are sort of some of the core questions that lead us to what the future of the web might look like or should look like.
Anne, can I ask you, we touched on this a little bit before, but from your experience studying other countries, Poland, Hungary, places like that, where do you put the Republican Party at this point on the continuum of small d Democratic parties? Does it still qualify as a small d Democratic Party in the Western tradition? Or when you look at the things we have seen over the last few years, but especially over the last few months, the very large number of Republicans in the House and the Republicans attorneys general who supported Trump in these baseless claims, does it still qualify as a small d Democratic Party in the Western tradition, or is it morphing into something else?
So obviously there's more than one part of the Republican Party. There's clearly a part of the party that is still committed to democracy, that is still committed to reality. I mean, not just not just Liz Cheney, but all, the election officials in Georgia who kept reaffirming the election, even though they were being challenged by the president. Same with election officials in Arizona and elsewhere. I mean, there's clearly and I would say a lot of voters of the party are still people who are committed to democracy and so on. I mean, there is now, though, clearly a part of the party, and I was just trying to explain this to a group of Europeans because it's actually not easy to understand, which is autocratic, but whose ideology diverges not for the reasons that you think you do. It's not because it's populist. It's not because they want, more money for the poor. It's not because they're anti-establishment. It's because they have come to live in an alternate reality. Their world of social media and right-wing broadcast media fed by the president, by other politicians, means that there's been a kind of epistemological break. And they live in another world in which, they no longer participate in the mainstream democratic conversation or in the mainstream democratic institutions. And the danger of that, of course, is that, just because they lost this time, it's not over. I mean, what if those officials in Georgia had been QAnon people or, MAGA guys who were committed to the idea that the election was stolen? What if we hadn't been so lucky as to have, state legislatures in Michigan and Pennsylvania who were still wanted to adhere to the rule of law and listen to what the voters say? My fear down the road is not so much even just what happens in Congress, but what happens lower down in the party as this anti-reality part of the party, kind of grows and metastasizes and becomes more popular.
Thanks. And Clint, a lot of people are asking, following up on what Anne was just saying. I mean, the reality is over 70 million people voted for Trump, and obviously what he said, there was an audience for his message, his persona, his resistance to change. Where do you think that? I mean, and the way voting blocks and power is distributed in the country, it is certainly within reach for that 74 million to control the House and the Senate after 2022. Where do you think that leaves us in terms of these kind of core issues of adherence to democracy, multiracial democracy. How big a challenge is that for Blue America to try to wrap its arms around?
Yeah, I mean,
for Clint. Right.
Clint, yeah, let Clint start. Yeah.
No, I'll just say that I think that this is part of why HR 1 and a new Voting Rights Act has to be a priority for this new administration, right? Like part of what, and this is part of what Elizabeth Warren ran on. The platform that she ran on is really sort of fundamentally solidifying and in some ways reimagining the infrastructure of democracy on a federal level and on a local level to make it possible so that the majority of people and potential voters in those places have the opportunity to vote. Part of what we saw over the course of, in part because of the pandemic, was that states were forced to expand many of or put in a position where they had to expand some of the voting apparatus, the extensions and apparatuses of their voting infrastructure in order to make it so that people had access to mail-in ballots, people had access to more extended early voting opportunities. And what we saw across the country, and most specifically, the way we saw it manifest itself in Georgia, was that it fundamentally, it gave us a different sense of like what the electorate in Georgia actually looks like, and made clear that Georgia has not simply been a red state, it's been a voter suppression state, right? And so, you know, as grateful as I am to some of the elected Republican officials in Georgia for not falling in line with what Trump wanted them to do and not succumbing to the pressure, so many of those officials are also people who over the course of years have put in place who have built a voting infrastructure that has prevented many Black people, many young people, many folks from a range of different backgrounds from having access to the polls in the way that they did now. And what we see already is that they're trying to go back to it.
Yeah, right. Brad Raffensperger, the hero of the recount, has endorsed the proposal from the state Senate Republicans to repeal on-demand absentee balloting in the aftermath of the election.
Because they know, to our previous point, they know that the numbers are against them. And in order for them to win, they have to restrict absentee, they have to restrict mail-in voting. They have to reduce the number of drop boxes. They have to reduce early voting. They have to make it so they're trying to make it so that you can't have buses go around in communities trying to get people to vote. I mean, the very things that organizations like Black Voters Matter did to go and get the vote out and information about the vote in communities that the sort of larger political infrastructure has forgotten about. That is part of what made Georgia, John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock successful. And they know that if that continues, they know that that Stacey Abrams and LaTosha Brown and so many others, that they have created a playbook that will continue to work, not just in Georgia, but in other states, and they're pushing back against it as hard as they can.
I've got to let our panel go. I got to let our audience go. But Anne, let me, because there's a whole bunch of questions that kind of tie into something that you just said, which is, you know, when you kind of think about the different components of the Republican Party, many questioners say, obviously, all 75 million people who voted for Trump are not conspiracy theorists. They don't all, you know, they're not all comfortable with the Confederate flag. But in a binary system where the choice is aligning with that or voting for a Democrat who you think is going to raise taxes too much and, you know, go crazy on social policy and regulate too much, this is what people choose. There are those who think that a multi-party system would isolate this kind of far right and provide kind of almost a safety valve. I know my friend Chris Cuomo talks about this a lot. Leaving aside the question of how viable that is in kind of the American context as it's currently written, do you think that if there were more choices, there would be less division?
So that's a hard question to ask because it would depend on what kind of voting system you had and so on. I mean, most European countries do have multi-party systems, and invariably you do get a far right party as well as a center right party. And very often the drama of politics is the battle between them. I mean, in quite a lot of countries, including, I mean, Austria, just off the top of my head, and many others, and Poland, in fact. That's one of the most important political divides. I mean, there are other ways to soften the blow. I mean, I mentioned ranked choice voting. There are ways to do, runoff primaries like we had in Georgia, where, a lot of candidates run and then the top two go to the final round, and the top two could even be from the same party. There are other things we could do to our system. I mean, I could bringing in a multi-party system. I can't imagine it being possible under the, but there are smaller things. There are ways of modifying and changing the voting system that could give people more of a sense of choice, or at least give people some investment. When you have ranked choice voting, then you care who's the first choice and who's the second choice. And so there are ways of building that into the system, and I hope that we will talk about those more over the next few months and years.
Well, thank you all. Clint, Anne, Adrienne, thank you for your time this morning. We're going to have to leave it there. That concludes our program today. We want to thank all of you for spending part of your morning with us, watching this virtual event, and for reading The Atlantic. If you missed or want to watch any part of this program again, you can look out for a note from our team with a link. If you haven't already, we hope you will consider subscribing. Visit the Atlantic.com site, Atlantic.com/subscribe for more detail. And we'll see you at another event soon. Until then, stay safe and thanks for reading.